His book titled And the Witnesses Were Silent by Wolfgang Gerlach. It's about the church in Germany and how it helped Hitler rise to power. It's an extremely difficult book to find. You wouldn't believe how much trouble I had finding this. It was really expensive. I only found a total of like 3 or 4 copies or something, but I have it, and I want to read it from beginning to end. So I scanned in a copy of my book so that I can read it for my own personal use, and we're going to read it together. I did scan it in, and it took me forever. I literally spent the past 2 days doing it. This book is really, really fascinating. I just look, check out the table of contents here. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. It's only really 236 pages long, so hopefully we can burn through this pretty quickly. Yeah, take a look at the preface. This is how it starts. This study was accepted in 1970 as a doctoral dissertation by the Evangelical Theological Faculty. For years, it went unpublished since it contradicted much of the accepted thought among veterans of the church struggle and leading church historians. Eventually, he was basically given funding to publish this, to write and publish it, turn it into a full-blown book, and it was quite an undertaking to accomplish. So anyway, we're starting on Part 1, the defamation of the Jews, 1933 to 1935. So let's start there. Within the soul of the German people, the groundwork for the exclusion of the Jews from German public life had been prepared sufficiently by 1933. The Church could look back on a long theologically rooted tradition of hostility toward the Jews. The state stood on the verge of consolidating its Volkish nationalist ideas about the Nordic race and the need for racial purity into a set of governing principles. Walking into this, if you guys are unfamiliar with it, I'm just going to explain some terms as we go. I already talked about Volkish and what it means in the previous one, but for all intents and purposes, Volk, V-O-L-K, means race, and Volkish means racist. Not exactly. There are some mystical qualities to the terms, and Volkish means more kind of supernaturally, mystically unique and special. Like German Aryan people are kind of divinely chosen and everybody else is inferior. That's really what Volkish means. But for our uses, we'll use race and racist for Volk and Volkish. Given the general mindset of the German population, the only thing still lacking was the appropriate legislation. So German people were absolutely out of their heads on how special they are, and all they needed was legislation to force non-Aryans out of government and public life in any way. Some church leaders shared the state's new consciousness. The guidelines of the German Christian faith movement, published on 26th of May 1932, announced, quote, "We see race, Volkstum, or ethnic cultural heritage, and the nation as God-given orders of life entrusted to us by God. It is God's law that we provide for their preservation. We view the mission to convert the Jews as a grave danger to our Volkstum." Again, it's kind of like our racist ethnic superiority and the culture around it. That's what Volkstum means. "In it is the point of entry for alien blood into the body of our folk." Alien blood. Isn't that an interesting term to use, considering the immigration talk about illegal immigrants and illegal aliens and stuff in the United States? Jews, of course, were the quote-unquote illegal immigrants in Germany, in their minds at least. It's the point of entry for alien blood into the body of our folk. It has no right to exist alongside the foreign missionary enterprise. We reject the mission to the Jews in Germany as long as the Jews possess their rights of citizenship, and therefore, as long as the danger of mongrelization and the danger that they can disguise their racial identity exists. Of course, they claimed that people were mongrels. Americans and British and everybody, they had non-Aryan people in the country and were breeding with them, and that made them inferior to pure-blooded Aryans, quote-unquote. So it says, we reject the mission to the Jews in Germany as long as the Jews possess rights of citizenship, and therefore, as long as the danger of mongrelization and the danger that they can disguise their racial identity exists. In particular, marriage between Germans and Jews is to be prohibited. Point 9. At the time, DNA didn't exist. We didn't understand what DNA was, of course. So all of this stuff about pure-blooded this and that, and being able to hide their racial identity was just fabricated nonsense. They had no idea that there was anything different from Jews than anybody else. All they knew is that they needed somebody to blame for their problems, so they pinned it on non-Aryans, people that were not like them. And another thing, the Nazi Party conflated race and religion. Is Judaism a race of people, or is it a religious group? The answer is it's a religious group. But throughout the generations, this religious group, just like Catholics and Baptist groups and others, refused to kind of intermarry. They self-segregated. And they were segregated by different cultures throughout history. So they share a common ethnic lineage as a result of being separated from other cultures, largely. And as a result, they were targeted with racist attacks by the Nazi Party, even though it's just a religion. The Evangelical Church, or the Reich Church is what it was called in Germany, that was the whole argument. Was it a race or was it a religion? Can people convert to Christianity from Judaism? Nazis claimed no. The Reich Church, well, before the Reich Church, the Confessing Church, the one that was opposed to it, the Confessing Church claimed, yes, they can convert to Christianity from Judaism. Eventually, the Reich Church took over everything, co-opted the entire religious movement in Germany, and they said, no, they can't convert. So that was the basis of all of it. The underlying assumption was that there was a difference between being German and being Jewish, although civil law, at least, still recognized German Jews as citizens. Quote, God's law, unquote, proclaimed in point 7, lacked only legal ratification. That same year, however, some critics raised their voices, quote, against any falsification of the biblical gospel, end quote. In October 1932, the District Synod of Elberfeld in the Rhineland issued a protest to be read from every pulpit, quote, against any disparagement and any disdain for the Old Testament, end quote, and confessed, quote, Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, who has suffered death on behalf of all peoples without racial distinction, end quote. A synod, by the way, is kind of like an assembly of religious people, so it was predominantly Lutheran in the area, and they had assemblies of people that they called synods. Also, the Rhineland, Elberfeld in the Rhineland was kind of a rural community that was, I think, technically part of Germany, but it was kind of a DMZ between different countries. So it was a little bit more free to act and speak, the people in the Rhineland were, than people in, say, Berlin, for example. So the Rhineland really represented what rural communities thought without the effect of a loss of freedom of speech, basically. These two voices, one Volkish, i.e. racist effectively, one Volkish Christian and one biblically Christian, were early portents for the events of 1933. The chances for an objective and humane resolution of the Jewish question, quote-unquote, were still open. Again, little things like this I'm going to explain as we go, because I want, I don't want this to just be me reading. I want this to be kind of a commentary on this subject. And some people may be coming into this in part 1 or part 2 or whatever and may be unaware. Jewish question effectively meant the immigration problem, because it was an immigration thing ultimately. Lucky for us, or unlucky, however you view it, we can kind of see the same environment in the United States as we saw in like the teens and the 20s in Germany, like before the Nazi Party's rise to power or control or whatever. Even in the early 1900s, people were kind of working the German people into their religion, much like Christianity has, much like evangelical far-right Christianity has worked America into the religion, right? Like this, for example.
And he wrote down, he wrote a course to New Israel.
You're talking about George Washington and the other founding fathers.
New Israel. And when they came off the ship, they didn't plant an American flag. They planted the Christian flag.
I mean, I'm sure I don't need to say this is all made up, like all of it.
On the soil, they dedicated. George Washington knelt and prayed. dedicated America where the Twin Towers stand or stood. That's where America came into covenant with Yahweh, with God, was where the Twin Towers stand.
Wow.
So the German claim at the time was that the Jewish race, quote unquote, had been usurped and replaced by the Christian race or the Christian group of people or whatever, the Christian demographic. Jews had been rejected by God, and Christians came in, Aryans came in, and became God's new people. That was the concept behind the words Volkisch and Volkstum. There was something supernaturally special about these people and about their culture. And Jews, having been rejected by God, were sick and satanic and evil, and were trying to take control of the government, and you never knew who was Jewish because they looked just like us. So they just kind of secretly, quietly slipped into society and got to positions at the very top and imposed their will on Germans. That's the belief behind it. It's useful to kind of draw parallels between then and now so that we can kind of understand the mindset of the era. And I have a billion examples of that. It's not just Shane Vaughn. There are like tons and tons of influential congressmen and presidents and things like that who have that same kind of viewpoint. Anyway, let's keep reading here. The chances for an objective and humane resolution of the Jewish question were still open. Within months, however, any such possibility vanished, in part because of the rapid implementation of Nazi racial laws, in part because of the Church's failure to protest them. This is a complicated philosophical question. Should the Church have gotten involved in politics? I stand for separation of church and state. Would it have been right? Should I have advocated for the Church to stand up against the Nazi movement? I'll talk about it a little bit more in a while. This is chapter 1. Church responses to early anti-Jewish measures. Despite the intense pace of Hitler's early weeks in office, it was in his own vital interest that the policies toward the Jews, as outlined in Mein Kampf, his book titled My Struggle, where he laid out his plans, be carried out skillfully. I personally believe that Hitler planned the whole thing beginning to end, where he was going and how to get there, maybe from the moment of the beer hall putsch, even before that, where he did this coup against the government, this insurrection against them, and almost succeeded, got sentenced to 5 years in prison for high treason. In retrospect, the rapid succession of events between March 23rd and April 1st, 1933, suggest a calculated drama. I believe March 23rd is when Hitler officially took control of the government through the Enabling Act. That's when people consider the German government to be gone and be replaced with Hitler's regime. And April 1st was the first anti-Jewish legislation. So it was like a week or a week and a half before things really started ramping up. The first step was the March 23rd law for the removal of distress from people and state, the Enabling Act, which gave the government the right to pass laws without the Reichstag's consent, which is their Congress. The Reichstag is Congress. Even when these laws deviated from the Constitution. The government was very much just like the United States government. I mean, they're analogous to each other. This set the precedent for the next step. The April 1st boycott of the Jews, a deliberate experiment for a law that would isolate the Jews from state and society. The boycott of April 1st. Given the almost universal acclaim in Germany for the Enabling Act, it was easy to justify the boycott of the Jews as a defensive reaction against the Jewish parasites threatening the Volk. In the words of the NS Courier, where there was reason to fear that the boycott would meet with protest, the Nazi press declared the government's actions to be the acts of communists. That was the Nazis' primary political enemy. Jews didn't really have much political sway. They were a small minority group in the country, really small. Communists were somewhere in the vicinity of about a third of the political movements. Catholics were kind of the center party. Communists were on the left, and Nazis were on the right. By the way, the SA, before we read the next sentence, the SA was the brown shirts. It was basically like the Proud Boys, modern-day Proud Boys. They were people who went on the streets and fought Hitler's enemies. They would, beat up political opponents and capture them and whatever it took. That's what the SA was originally, until they were renamed to the SA, which is an abbreviation for a big, long German word. The vandalism of the SA was played down as revolutionary overzealousness. This did not fail to have an effect among church officials and lay Christians. The fear of communism was great everywhere and needed only to be exploited skillfully by the party. Communism and atheism were linked to each other at the time, and the Catholic Church went hard against atheists and communists for that reason, if no other. So all the Nazi Party needed to do was ingratiate themselves with and work with the Catholic Center Party, and they could overrule anything that the communists did. However, the communists were equally as violent as the Nazis, and they would fight Nazis, quote, blow for blow, shot for shot, punch for punch. That fact scared the Nazis in the 1920s. The Nazi Party viewed the outcome of the experimental boycott of Jewish commercial, medical, and legal practices as promising. Confronted by the staged demonstration of the, quote, powerful people's movement, unquote, which Herman Goring defended by citing, quote, the boycott and atrocity propaganda by the Jews at home and abroad, end quote, protest against the boycott was limited. Goring would eventually go on to be he was the leader of the Luftwaffe. It was the German Air Force. Before that, he was a member of the Reichstag. He was a congressman, basically. And before that, he worked closely with the Nazi Party, and he was second in command, effectively, to Hitler. So Hitler drew up plans like if he died, Goring was the one that would take control next. And he pulled a lot of strings and stood in for Hitler where it was convenient and things like that. Anyway, back to the book here. The Nazi Party viewed the outcome of the experimental boycott of Jewish commercial, medical, and legal practices as promising. Confronted by the staged demonstrations of the, quote, powerful people's movement, end quote, which Herman Goring defended by citing the, quote, boycott and atrocity propaganda by the Jews at home and abroad, end quote, protest against the boycott was limited. Here and there, sheltered in diaries, a few quiet voices suffered under their faint-hearted church. The respected novelist Johan Klepper, whose wife was Jewish, wrote, quote, the silent pogrom today reached a high point with the legalization of the boycott against Jewish businesses, judges, lawyers, doctors, artists. The hatred this sows among young Jews must become terrible. Beginning of a new age? But I believe in God's mystery which he established in Judaism, and because of that, I can only suffer under the fact that the Church tolerates the present proceedings. I sense what it means to be a servant of God, quote unquote. The end of Johan Klepper's diary entry. There's little evidence of abhorrence within the church for the intensifying anti-Semitism. One such response came from the Rhineland, remember, the rural DMZ area that was more free to speak, came from the Rhineland where Wilhelm Menn, a social welfare pastor, wrote to his superintendent, Dr. Stoltenhoff. All right, so this is a quote from Dr. Stoltenhoff. Quote, the personal persecution of people whose guilt consists of nothing more than political conviction or of belonging to a race, this persecution with the clear aim of destroying their very existence is a slap in the face of the simplest moral judgment. It's obvious that the masses cannot be permitted for years and years to scream, to hell with the Jew, without eventually succumbing to this brutal desire for persecution. And our Christian folk rejoices. We have never doubted any people as deeply as now. Who will have the courage to say what needs to be said here, to say that the Christian church clearly characterizes it as a moral injustice, as anti-Christian, to persecute and injure individuals because they belong to a group against which it appears necessary, for some reason, to fight? Do we not owe such a statement above all to those Jewish people who have become Christians? Again, right here, the heart of the argument. These people didn't care about Jews. Most of them agreed with hatred against Jews, with anti-Semitism. It was about whether it was a race or a religion. Should they be allowed to join the Christian church? The Catholic Church and the Evangelical or the Protestant Church by 1933, not even that far into any crazy shit. They were still free to say what they wanted, but by that time, They both, at the very top, instructed their pastors to swear an oath of allegiance to Hitler and to ban Jewish converts to Christianity from being a part of the ministry in any way. There were some smaller groups, some smaller churches that disagreed. A couple thousand pastors out of like 18,000 total in the Reich Church disagreed with that. But they couldn't say it openly eventually. So they, behind the scenes, worked to save some people. The Catholic Church, as a monolith, supported Hitler. A couple of parishes, a couple of like groups of nuns and things helped people and cared. But it was so extremely uncommon because the environment was one in which people were obsessed with how special they were, and they does not include Jews, the race of Jews, quote unquote. Stoltenhoff's reply exemplified the feelings of most Christians at the time. He expressed, quote, great joy at what these drastic changes have brought us, end quote, even while he acknowledged a certain concern, quote unquote, that the individual, quote unquote, could do, quote, next to nothing against the elemental force for this movement of our age, end quote. Typical, too, was his candid animosity toward the Jews. Quote, but I must say this openly. I can understand why the legitimate resentment, which is built up even among those who are in no way anti-Semitic, at what the Jewish-dominated press, stock exchange, theater, etc. have done to us, needs an energetic outlet, end quote. So they're saying, yeah, Jews have oppressed us and mistreated us and messed with us and ruined everything, and the people need an outlet. An energetic outlet for that. That was kind of the sentiment. In Berlin, General Church Superintendent Otto Dibelius felt called to comment on the 1st of April boycott. His earlier comments, however, already revealed the inherent conflict between his nationalist, bourgeois, and anti-Semitic background and his subsequent role as a confessing Christian in opposition to the state. Bourgeois, of course, meaning like upper middle class, rich, effectively. And it was, generally viewed as a bad thing to be bourgeois because it was like a populist environment at the time. In 1928, Dibelius had accused, quote, a strong Jewish element, end quote, of propelling, quote unquote, Germany's political leadership in a, quote, calculated and malignant, end quote, direction. That same year, he sent an Easter message to the pastors in his district. Quote, my dear brothers, all of us will not only understand but have complete sympathy for the final motivations behind the Volkisch movement. Remember, like the racist movement, basically. Despite the evil ring that the word has acquired in many cases, I have always considered myself an anti-Semite. It cannot be denied that Judaism plays a leading role in all the corruptive phenomena of modern civilization. God bless us Christians and our Easter proclamation. Dibelius eventually went on to do some pretty heinous stuff and support some real heinous stuff too. Anyway, continuing on. Dibelius's commentary on the April 1st, 1933 boycott appeared in the April 4th Berlin Evangelische Sonntagsblatt. Evangelisch means evangelical, effectively. It wasn't evangelical in the way that you may be thinking. They were Lutheran. And evangelisch may more accurately translate here to Protestant. But I've been calling it the Evangelical Church because that's effectively what it was for the most part, depending on how you define it. So Dibelius's commentary appeared in this newspaper. Quote, the last 15 years in Germany have strengthened Jewry's influence to an extraordinary degree. The number of Jewish judges, Jewish politicians, Jewish civil servants in influential positions has grown measurably. Of course, that's like completely false. Jews were just integrating into the society, but people were looking for a scapegoat for their problems, and they found it. In fact, a lot of Jews at the time and in that place were also ultra-nationalists in the same way that everybody else was. Like this Volkisch thing, race and racist, this extreme ethnocentric racist attitude existed in a lot of Jews in that time and place also. They viewed themselves as Germans, because they'd lived there for like hundreds of years. Their families were from Germany. They didn't even talk about the old stuff, from where they were before. They cared about the German country, and they cared so much that they even volunteered to fight in World War I in a disproportionate amount. Like, proportionally more Jews fought on the front lines than Aryans, quote unquote. But they were eventually turned against. Meanwhile, foreign interest in the ominous events in Germany had been awakened. The tone of press and radio reports abroad was quite different from that of reports within the Reich. Reich meaning empire, is the German Empire. In Germany, however, elation about the new tough government, the national breakthrough, quote unquote, and the vote of confidence in the new Führer led even church leaders to criticize these foreign reports as typical statements of inflammatory Jewish propaganda. So, foreign radio and newspaper reports were talking about the extreme mistreatment of Jews during the April 1st boycott, basically, and showing pictures and stuff of real heinous stuff, people being beaten to death, of the word Jew painted across their storefronts, things like that. If it was bad enough for foreign press to report on the mistreatment of Jews before we had any kind of social media, before we had cameras or like video cameras, before we had like any of that stuff, imagine how bad it was. In the early 90s, Rodney King was a dude that was beaten half to death by, I think, the LAPD. This had been happening for years and years and years, but nobody could prove it because they didn't have video cameras. In the early 90s, video cameras started to be a little bit more commercially available, more common among normal people. And somebody was filming Rodney King being beaten half to death by the cops from a window. When that appeared in court, when those officers were criminally charged, people said, finally, we can show what's happening to us. Those police officers were acquitted of all charges. I think there were like 12 of them. Cop cars just kept showing up. Cops get out and take turns beating the shit out of the guy. Imagine how bad it must have been for the world to take notice before video cameras even existed. Anyway, let's continue. DiBellius responded to the foreign press coverage in a radio speech that was reprinted in the April 6, 1933 Reichsanzeiger. Quote, "There is not one true word in the ghastly news reports about the gruesome and bloody treatment of the communists." The communists? We're talking about Jews here. On the basis of these false reports, the Jewish community in several countries has begun agitating against Germany. In order to break this boycott, the German National Socialists, or the Nazis, that's what that term meant, the Nazis have now initiated a boycott movement against German Jewry. This boycott has been limited for the present to one single day. It's proceeded with absolute calm and order. Isn't that interesting? There has been only one single bloody incident in Kiel. In Berlin and in the rest of the Reich, or the Empire, nothing of the same nature has occurred. The boycott has been lifted until further notice. The government desires to wait and see what happens in the outside world in the coming days. In addition, the government operation is underway to remove the Jews from public administration, particularly the judiciary. Jews in Germany make up not even 1% of the population. I mean, that should tell you something, that, like, Jews aren't causing a problem, but okay. The proportions here should become again what they were previously. The Christian Church stands for chivalry and love. The Church fervently wishes that the hour may soon come when violence is no longer necessary, but in which the newly ordered life of the state allows room for love and justice. That will depend on whether the foreign agitation against Germany stops or not. For this reason, as a servant of my church, I sincerely and urgently ask my Christian friends in America to use their influence so that false news reports about Germany are no longer disseminated and believed. End quote. Even back then, even at the time, they were saying that there's like this secret cabal of people who's trying to take advantage of others, trying to work their way to the top, to control everything. Even while they're being beaten in the streets, this is happening. The United States, they can't really say that about Black Americans because they're easily identifiable. But Germans at the time could point fingers and say, this person's Jewish, that person's Jewish, and all they'd have to go on was a last name that might have kind of sounded a little bit Jewish. Hell, maybe the person wasn't involved in the religion in any way. Maybe they were just like part of this family and they'd married into like a Catholic family and they're now Catholic. Didn't matter. They believe they're pulling strings. They're part of this overarching cabal. And by the way, the word cabal, commonly used in the United States by like QAnoners, for example, comes from the word Kabbalah. It's a Jewish term. Kabbalah is like a form of meditation. It's outlined in the book of Zohar. It's just one of their holy books at the end of the Old Testament. And it makes some pretty mystical claims, the philosophy about if you master Kabbalah, you'll be able to like accomplish like telekinesis and things like that. But the last Kabbalah master died and his knowledge died with him. So all we can do is just use it to meditate and to think and be introspective and things. That's all that Kabbalah is. The bottom line is that there are a lot of misunderstandings, and they're being exaggerated and blown completely out of proportion in the interest of pointing a finger and blaming people for their problems, their hyperinflation problems and things. Back to the book. On April 9th, DiBellas issued a similar statement in a Berlin church newspaper. One should not get excited, he said, about minor excesses. Undisturbed, Jewish firms are open for business, newspapers in Jewish hands are being published without hindrance, and public calm and order prevail. Law and order. Nothing bad's happening. We're just peacefully protesting, just expressing ourselves. Any of this sounding familiar? It's exactly what happened with January 6th. It looked really, really bad, and then slowly but surely turned into, it's just a protest. Nobody did anything wrong, and if they did do something wrong, then it was the other side that was doing it. DiBellas blamed the uproar over the boycott on Jewry's international connections and predicted that when German Jewry becomes economically threatened, the overseas agitation will end that much sooner. He recommended closing Germany's eastern border against Eastern Jews as a protective measure and appealed to the German steadfastness that will not succumb to an alien race. Reminder, DiBellas, Otto Dibelius, he was a general church superintendent, so he was speaking on behalf of the Protestant Church in Germany, which is very much unified. It was one body, effectively. It controlled entire towns in some areas, largely to the north, and the Catholic Church controlled towns to the south. But the Evangelical Church, or the Protestant Church in Germany, was pretty much entirely made up of Reformed Christian, which is like a Calvinist denomination, and Lutherans, which is very similar to Catholicism in many ways. So anyway, it eventually became like a unified group, and he represented all of it in his statements here. DiBellas' opinion was not just influential at the time. After 1945, he served as Bishop of Berlin-Brandenburg and later became president of the Evangelical Church of Germany. How, in retrospect, did he view his earlier comments? In 1965, Bishop DiBellas, who claimed that he never had anything to do with an aggressive anti-Semitism, answered my personal inquiry. So the writer of the book contacted DiBellas, and he said, quote, "And if there are some who wish to place me in the dock together with the actual anti-Semites, then they may do so without hesitation." Good, I planned to. I have never made a secret of my attitude. As in most families of higher-ranking civil servants in the old Germany, there was no discussion in our home about the problem of Judaism. Really? It's super strange considering all the other stuff he said about it. But one bought from Jews only in an emergency and avoided personal contact with them as a matter of course, not due to hostility, but because one sensed, after all, the foreignness in their nature. After 1933, the situation changed, for it goes without saying that the Protestant Christian stands by those who are treated unjustly and violated. It's always been a matter of satisfaction to me that I succeeded in saving 2 Jewish families through the entire period of persecution, and indeed at some risk to my own freedom. So he contributed to the blood frenzy that existed against Jews, and then took credit for saving 2 Jewish families afterward. I have a really hard time forgiving the church for all the stuff they did. Like Niemöller, the leader of the opposition against the Nazi Party in the church, wrote famously, first they came for the communists, but I wasn't a communist. Next they came for the socialists, so on and so forth. He wrote that. He was a Nazi that voted for Nazis in 1924, 1928, and 1933, and was sent to a concentration camp for opposing reforms within the church to exclude Jews, and tried to join the Navy from the concentration camp. He was as extreme as it gets. I have a hard time forgiving him for that. Even though he had a change of heart at the end, I'm sorry, I have a hard time forgiving it. Dibelius' candor reflected both the nationalist anti-Semitism of his age and his Christian ethics concerning the persecuted. He exemplified the many Christians who did not lack the courage to stand up for the Jews, but lacked insight into the consequences of anti-Jewish sentiment. The language of ideology spoke of Jewry, quote-unquote. The language of ethics focused on the individual Jew. However, he later justified it. Dibelius' attitude toward the Jews can be considered representative of German Christianity at the beginning of 1933. Again, 1933, the early days, before April 1st, people were free to say and do what they wanted. There was no, mandate for support of Hitler yet. But the Protestants and the Catholics both supported him anyway. It's hard to forgive. Dibelius is not the only church leader to respond to foreign protests against the April 1st boycott. The German Reformierte Kirchenzeitung, Reformed Church newspaper, scolded the presbytery of the Amsterdam South Parish, which had asked the Dutch Council of Churches to protest the persecution of the Jews in Germany. Quote, "This step on the part of our friend is more than superfluous. What has happened in Germany is not the persecution of the Jews, but an emergency measure lasting only a few days, during which every act of violence has been carefully avoided. The fact that this measure was forced upon us by the behavior of the foreign Jewish press is one that no one regrets more than we Christians in Germany, and we are satisfied that when the campaign of lies ceases, the boycott of the business of our Jewish fellow citizens will cease as well." This is a lot like Donald Trump saying, "I'll release my tax returns," when Hillary releases the 30,000 emails she deleted. Setting in unreachable goalpost. It's impossible to accomplish their preconditions. It's impossible for Jews to, cease their campaign of lies, quote unquote, because there was no campaign of lies orchestrated by Jews. This is just an excuse they're using to hurt them more. The same paper dismissed accounts that had appeared in a Scottish church paper, Scots Observer, which reported that religious persecution had forced thousands of Jews to leave Germany. In truth, wrote the Reformierte Kirchenzeitung, only East European Jews were forced into emigration, emigration. So emigration is leaving a country, immigration is going to a country. Only East European Jews were forced into emigration, and the only Jews emigrating voluntarily, such as Emil Kohn Ludwig, Leon Feuchtwanger, Einstein, and others like them, are those who see that in a newly respectable Germany, they will lose their effectiveness. Oh yeah, Einstein. Albert Einstein was a Jewish person from Germany who fled. And oh man, were the Nazis upset when they found out that Einstein discovered or invented or whatever general relativity. They were not happy. It's difficult to form a complete picture of the April 1st boycott's effect on the German public. The brutality of the outrages against Jews and Jewish businesses was covered up by party officials. Few people dared to show public solidarity with the Jews. Organized protests failed to occur. A few isolated protests emerged from the ranks of the Evangelical Church. One was sent to the Church Federation office in Frankfurt by Church Councilman Johannes Cabal. I'm reading it here, it says the Evangelical Church. Somebody in the comments of the first video said they stopped listening to the breakdown because I called it the Evangelical Church, and that's just wrong. Looking back, that's kind of comical. It blows me away how confidently people are wrong sometimes, like in that case. Or I explained how the name Jehovah was not God's name, it was actually Yahweh. And somebody said in the comments that they cringe every time I explain it because it was based on Latin and it moved to blah, 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 blah. They said Jehovah is actually correct. And it's like, no, it's not. Like, I'm looking to scholars on this subject. This isn't coming from Owen. This isn't me. Anyway, whatever. People are going to be confidently wrong. This is why I'm so dead set on being careful about what I say and being willing to admit when I'm wrong. That is like the most important lesson you can learn, to say I don't know and to say I was wrong. By keeping silent, he said, the church had become an accomplice, whereas it should have raised the loud voice of Christian conscience. In other parts of the country, church administrations received inquiries as to whether and how the church should react to the anti-Semitic campaigns. All these protests, however, remained within the channels of internal church correspondence. Little reached the public. Church historian Klaus Schulder has concluded, correctly, the church as a whole remained silent. In the decisive days following April 1st, no bishop, no church administration, and no synod, or assembly, objected publicly to the persecution of the Jews in Germany. End quote. Absolutely fascinating. Next section is a legislative foundation for persecution. Tell me what you think about it in the comments. I'm so glad to have gotten my hands on this book.